For years, we lived by the creed: find them, kill them, burn the bodies. No hesitation, no mercy. That was the only way to deal with the undead. That was how we survived. But something has changed. Something is wrong. It started with small things. A shadow on the wall that stretched too far. A whisper in the dark that wasn't an echo. A scent in the air. Not blood, not decay, but something worse. At first, we ignored it. Paranoia, we told ourselves. A lifetime of hunting warps the mind. You start seeing things that aren't there. Then, we heard the scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything we recognized. And just like that, the roles reversed. We, the hunters, became prey. For almost a decade, we tried to leave it all behind. No more sharpened stakes. No more silver blades. No more waking up with blood under our nails and the taste of gunpowder in our throats. We settled into a quiet life. A small, forgotten town. A house at the edge of the woods, where no one asked questions and no one knocked on the door after sundown. The fireplace crackled at night. The wind carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else. Something we tried to ignore. The weapons were locked away, collecting dust. A museum of the past we swore we wouldn't revisit. But at night, when the world grew quiet, we could hear it. The scratching. Soft at first, like tree branches against glass. Then louder, more deliberate, slow, methodical, as if something was testing the house, testing us. We never spoke about it. Maybe we didn't want to admit that we felt it too. That familiar weight in the air. The kind that made our skin prickle and our instincts scream. Then, the killing started. We told ourselves it was an animal. A bear. A wolf. Something normal. Even when the bodies were found with their limbs twisted the wrong way, their mouths frozen open in silent screams, their eyes gone, ripped out, we clung to the lie. Because if we admitted the truth, we knew what came next. Then, one morning, it arrived. A corpse, at our doorstep. Not just dead, broken, bones shattered, joints bent backwards. Its mouth had been forced open so wide the jaw had snapped clean off and carved into its chest in jagged, trembling lines. You took their heads. Now we take yours. We stood there, staring at the body. No words, no breath. Just the cold certainty that whatever had done this wasn't just hunting. It was watching, and it wasn't going to stop. We should have left that corpse alone. Burned it, buried it, pretended we never saw it. But old habits die hard. We dragged the body inside, laid it on the table, and forced ourselves to look. Every wound, every unnatural break, every detail that didn't make sense. The injuries weren't random. The flesh had been peeled back in places, muscles sliced open with precise, surgical precision. The bones weren't just broken. They were shattered from the inside out. Nothing we'd ever hunted did this. The message carved into the chest was deep, jagged, as if the victim had still been breathing when it was written. You took their heads. Now we take yours. We had seen those words before, years ago, on the walls of a slaughterhouse in eastern Romania, where we tracked a nest of vampires that had been feeding on an entire village. That hunt had been brutal. We took our time with them, made sure every last one suffered before we drove the stakes through their hearts and burned what was left. No survivors, no loose ends. Or so we thought. The past was clawing its way back, and it had found us. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in silence, staring at the body as the firelight flickered against the walls. The air in the room felt wrong, too thick, too still. The house, which had always felt safe, suddenly felt watched. At some point, without meaning to, I let my eyes close. And that's when the dreams started. Flashbacks, the hunts, the faces of the vampires we'd killed, frozen in their final moments. One by one, I saw them again. The way they begged, the way their eyes went wide with terror when they realized there would be no mercy. Then, something different. Something I didn't remember. The bodies we'd burned, the heads we'd severed, the ashes left behind. Moving, shifting, reaching for me. A voice, low and rasping, whispering from somewhere just beyond my sight. "You missed one." I woke with a start, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was dark, too dark. The fire had burned out, but the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. No, not smoke. Something else. Something rotting. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room. I wasn't alone. I reached for the gun under my pillow, my fingers closing around the handle just as a voice, low, broken, wrong, murmured from the darkness. "It's not over." The lamp flickered back to life, and I was alone again. But the corpse on the table, it was smiling. The next day, we did what we swore we'd never do again. We armed ourselves. Silver-lined bullets, wooden stakes, ultraviolet flares. Every weapon we had ever used in the past was laid out, cleaned, checked, and loaded. But it didn't feel like enough. Vampires had rules. They had limits. There were ways to kill them. But this, whatever it was, played by different rules. We tracked the body's origin to the forest, just outside town. That was where the first killings had started, where the disappearances kept happening. The deeper we went, the more we felt it. Something unnatural, lurking just beyond our sight. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't stalk like a vampire. It waited, like it was amused, like it was letting us come closer. Then the air changed. The sounds of the forest, the wind through the trees, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of insects, vanished. Everything was silent, and the silence was loud. I turned, scanning the shadows between the trees. My breath felt too loud in my chest. My hand tightened around the hilt of my knife. Then, movement, a shape, just beyond the tree line, tall, unmoving, watching. I couldn't see the details, just the silhouette. Its body was wrong, limbs too long, head tilted at an impossible angle. Then its eyes opened, not glowing, not reflecting light, just empty. Black voids that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Then it did something worse. It grinned. Not a natural grin. Not a human grin. The mouth stretched farther than it should. The skin cracked. The jaw unhinged like a snake's. And from the darkness of that gaping, unnatural maw, it laughed. Low, broken. A sound that felt wrong in the air, as if it wasn't just being heard, but felt. It stepped forward, and the ground shifted beneath its feet, the very earth recoiling from its presence. We moved, fast, weapons raised, hands steady. But before we could fire, it was gone. No movement, no sound, just vanished. The forest around us remained deathly still. Then, from the darkness behind us, you took their heads. The voice was right at my ear. "Now we take yours." We turned. Nothing there. But when I looked down at the wooden stake gripped in my shaking hand, there was something new carved into the side. Deep. Fresh. Run. And for the first time in our lives, we did. We needed answers. And there was only one place left to get them. The underground syndicates. The ones who thrived in the spaces between human society. The ones we used to hunt. They weren't easy to find, and they weren't the type to welcome old enemies with open arms. But desperate men make desperate deals. So we went where the night was thickest, where the streetlights flickered, and the shadows stretched too long. The city's underbelly still smelled of old blood, of things rotting beneath the surface. There were places even the bravest men refused to walk after sundown. We went there willingly. A repurposed stadium stood in the heart of it. St. Augustine's, once a place of worship, now a sanctuary for creatures that defied God's design. The stained glass windows were shattered, the pews overturned, the altar stripped bare. In its place, a throne of old wood and iron sat beneath the fractured remains of a wooden structure. The thing sitting on it wasn't a priest. Raphael, an elder. He had lived for over 4 centuries, and for the first time, we saw something we never thought we'd see in his eyes. Fear. He leaned forward, his fingers, too long, too sharp, folding together as he studied us. "You're still alive," he mused. "A shame. I thought time would have done my work for me." We didn't have time for his games. "Something is killing your kind," we told him. His smirk faltered, just for a second. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. "Then it has taste." The room was filled with others. Lesser vampires, the kind that lurked at the edges of human society, the kind that fed on the forgotten. They were watching, listening, but they weren't laughing. "This isn't one of us," I said. His gaze flicked to mine, and something in it darkened. "Then what is it?" That was the question, and Raphael had an answer, or at least he thought he did. "Something worse." He stood, moving toward us, the candlelight throwing twisted shadows against the ruined walls. "You remember the hunts," he murmured. "The bodies you burned, the heads you took. You thought you were wiping us out, one by one, but you never stopped to wonder." He leaned in. "What happens to the ones who don't stay dead?" Before we could answer, the room changed. The air dropped. The fire in the candles flickered. Once, twice, then died. Total darkness. A whisper slid through the room. Something cold brushed past me. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Then, a sound. Wet. Tearing. The sickening rip of flesh being pulled apart. A gurgled gasp. The darkness lifted. And Raphael was gone. No warning. No struggle. His throne was empty. But his body, or what was left of it, was scattered across the floor. And there, on the cold stone where his head had been, was another message, carved, deep, fresh. "We are not like them." The vampires scattered, even the oldest of them, the ones who had seen war, seen death, seen worse things than we could name. They ran. Whatever was hunting us wasn't just taking heads. It was sending a message, and we weren't listening fast enough. So we went back to the beginning, to the corpse, to the symbols carved into its flesh. We had taken photographs before we burned it. The markings were jagged, erratic, wrong. They didn't match any vampire sigils we knew. But there was something familiar about them. Something we had seen before. Somewhere we had been. We dug through old case files, through the notebooks filled with scribbles from hunts long past. And then we found it. A village. Years ago. A forgotten place with no name, buried deep in the forests of Eastern Europe. A massacre. Not by us. By something else. The bodies had been found just like this one. Ripped apart. Symbols carved into their flesh. And in the center of it all, one final warning, scrawled in blood. You were warned. We had ignored it then. We wouldn't make the same mistake twice. We needed proof. So we set up cameras. Night vision. Infrared. Anything to catch what we couldn't see with our own eyes. One of our own, Jacob, examined the markings in real time. He traced a gloved finger over the grooves in the wood. Then he stopped. His breath caught. Did you hear that? I hadn't heard anything. He turned his head. Eyes darting, searching. Then he stopped breathing. His chest rose, fell, froze. His mouth opened, just a little, just enough for a strangled wheeze to slip free. Then his eyes rolled back. His body stiffened, and just before the camera cut to static, I saw it. Not a shadow, not a person, just a glimpse, a shape behind him, something shifting, as if it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Then, darkness. We followed the trail of bodies to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. It should have been empty. It wasn't. Inside, blood. So much blood. The walls were covered in symbols, not written, carved. The wooden structures had been broken, rearranged into something else. A pattern, a ritual. And the bodies, the vampire elders, were placed within it. They weren't just killed, they were used. Their bodies had been stripped open, their bones arranged in deliberate, intricate positions, their skulls facing upward, as if staring towards something unseen. And at the center, a single altar. Fresh blood pooled on the stone surface. Something was written in it. Not a warning, not a threat. A name. Not ours, not anyone we recognized. But the moment we saw it, the symbols on the walls ignited. A sudden, searing heat shot through my arm. I screamed. I looked down, and there, on my skin, the same symbol began to carve itself into my flesh. I felt every line, every cut, every piece of me claimed. The others tried to help. They tried to stop it. But it was too late. The room shook. The blood on the altar began to boil. And from the darkness above, a voice whispered, deep, crawling, ancient. You should have let them rest. And then, the candles died, and we weren't alone anymore. I could feel it. We were out of our depth. We had spent our lives fighting monsters, but this wasn't something we could fight. Not yet. We needed answers. The kind that weren't found in police reports or crime scene photographs. The kind hidden in dust-covered tomes, in the margins of forgotten scriptures, in the pages people were too afraid to read. There was only one person who might have those answers. Father Carrigan. He wasn't a priest. Not anymore. He was something else. A man who had seen too much, known too much, and had barely lived to tell the tale. His home was a mausoleum of lost knowledge, a place where books outnumbered breaths. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and wax, of ink long dried and candles burned down to nothing. The moment we stepped inside, he knew. His hands trembled as he reached for a book. Not just any book. A locked manuscript, bound in cracked leather, its title long since faded. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You should have left this alone." We didn't have that luxury. We told him everything. The bodies, the symbols, the way they burned into flesh, as if alive. He listened in silence. Then slowly, he opened the book. The pages were delicate, brittle with time. The ink was smudged in places, written by hands that had shaken while writing. And there, between the faded lines of scripture, between the prayers meant to keep something sealed, was a name. A name we had never heard before. A name whispered like a curse in the pages of forbidden texts. "This isn't a vampire," Kerrigan murmured. His fingers traced the word, but he didn't dare say it aloud. "This is what vampires fear." His words made my stomach turn. Because vampires, they feared nothing. And yet, something had been hunting them. Something had been consuming them. Something was erasing them from existence. And then, before we could even breathe, before the weight of what he said could even settle, the room shifted. The candles flickered, their flames twisting, curling. Then, they went out. The only light left was the dying glow of the fireplace. But something was wrong. The fire wasn't just burning, it was moving. The flames pulled together, coiling into a single shape. A word. One that seared itself into the pages of the book, the heat curling the edges, turning them black. And then, the book burst into flames. The fire raced across the pages, the ink bleeding through, forming a single name. The Devourer. The fire roared. And then, the book turned to ash in Kerrigan's hands. The room fell into a deathly silence. And in that silence, something whispered. Not a voice, not a sound, but something that slid against the edges of reality. Something that knew we were here, and something that was coming. We had one chance, one shot to stop it before it took another. We had hunted for long enough to know the rules. But this wasn't about rules. This was about desperation. Salt circles, holy water, UV lights, everything we had ever used against creatures of the night, we reinforced. We laid traps the way a dying man writes his will. Frantically, desperately, with no guarantees. We laced the floors with lines of silver dust. We rigged every exit, every shadowed corner, every place it could hide. We would see it this time. We would stop it. And so, we waited. The air in the cathedral was thick. Every breath felt like it was pulled through tar. The candles flickered, their light weakening. Something was coming. Then, a footstep, soft where deliberate, inside the trap. I saw it. A shape, shifting between forms, flickering between things it had devoured. One moment it had wings, the next, it had too many teeth. It had no face, until it did. The face I recognized, a face we had burned years ago. The face of a vampire we had killed with our own hands. It smiled, and then it stepped into the UV light. The trap should have worked. The light should have burned it. The salt should have held it back. Instead, it kept walking, unaffected, unstoppable, unreal, and then It spoke. Not with words, not with a voice, but with our own memories. Did you think it would be that easy? And then, it moved, faster than anything I had ever seen. Before we could react, before we could even breathe. The lights shattered. The salt scattered, and we were exposed. We ran. We had no choice. The cathedral was crumbling around us. The symbols we had drawn on the walls were twisting, turning into something wrong. Reality itself was warping. The hallways stretched longer. The doors led nowhere. Every time we turned a corner, the devourer was there, waiting, watching, laughing. Then, we reached the final door, the exit. We burst through it, throwing ourselves into the cold night air. And for a split second, for a single breath, we thought we had made it. Then I heard the scream. One of us was missing. I turned back, and I saw the door wasn't a door anymore. It was gone, sealed, replaced with nothing but stone. No way in, no way out. And behind it, a voice, their voice, muffled, fading. Don't let it take me. And then, silence. We had lost one, and we weren't even close to stopping it. We weren't alone. Somehow, someone had made it out. At first, we didn't even realize he was there. The night was thick, the air damp with the scent of old stone and rotting leaves. Our breathing was shallow, barely controlled. Every nerve in our bodies told us to move, to keep running. But something held us in place. A presence, not the devourer. Something else. Then, a cough. Wet, strained, barely human. And just ahead, slumped against a broken gravestone, was him. His clothes were torn, drenched in blood. His eyes, wild, glassy, snapped to us the moment we stepped closer. It was one of the vampire elders, or what was left of him. His chest heaved with every breath, his ribs visible through the gashes in his flesh. Deep wounds crisscrossed his body, but none of them were fatal. Not yet. He should have been dead. And yet, he was still alive. Barely. His fingers twitched as he tried to reach for us. His lips trembled, forming words that barely made it past his throat. It doesn't kill you. His voice was barely a whisper. It rewrites you. The words hit like a hammer to the skull. We froze. What the hell did that mean? We barely had time to ask. His breath hitched. His whole body seized up. Then, the sound. A horrible wet crack as his spine arched in a way no body should. His fingers clawed at the dirt, his mouth gaping open. And then, the convulsions began. It was violent. Every muscle in his body jerked, his limbs twitching like a puppet with its strings tangled. His mouth gaped, his jaw cracking, as if something was trying to force its way out. This wasn't healing. This was rewriting. His skin rippled. Not his skin. Something beneath it. Moving. Shifting. Like something else was trying to break through. His breath hitched, turning into short, rapid gasps. His eyes, oh God. His eyes weren't his anymore. 1 second, they were black. The next, they flickered between colors, between shapes, between things that shouldn't belong in a human skull. And then, he spoke. But it wasn't just his voice. It was more. More than one. More than should be possible. 1,000 voices, layered over each other, rising and falling, screaming and laughing and whispering all at once. But beneath them, one voice stood out. One we recognized. "You can't kill me." The words slammed into us like a blade to the gut. It was his voice now. The hunter we had lost. The one we had heard screaming behind the stone door. "You already let me in." And then, he smiled. His lips curled too wide, his teeth too sharp, his mouth stretching into something that shouldn't be humanly possible. The thing beneath his skin pushed forward, twisting, warping his flesh. And the last thing we saw before we ran was his hand reaching out. Not for help, but in invitation. We were running out of time. The signs had been there. The whispers just beyond our hearing. The way our own shadows lingered a little too long before following our movements. The unnatural stillness in the air, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. But we ignored it. We thought we still had control. We thought we could still fight back. Until we saw the footage. It was late. The storm outside had begun to stir, wind howling through the shattered windows of the safe house. Rain battered against the walls in relentless waves. But inside, the air was deathly still. The flickering screen of a laptop cast a pale, sickly glow over our faces as we huddled around it, staring at the looping footage from one of our cameras. It had been set up outside the church, facing us as we retreated inside. A last-ditch effort to document whatever was happening to us. At first, the footage seemed normal. We saw ourselves enter, one by one, exhausted, bloodied, shaken to the core. We barely recognized ourselves anymore. Then, something changed. It was subtle at first. A flicker, a distortion in the frames. But then, our reflections began to shift. Not all at once. Not in a way we immediately noticed. But one of us moved. Differently. A fraction of a second before the others. A hesitation, as if they had forgotten how to mimic human movement. We leaned in closer. And then, the delay grew. One of us wasn't moving in sync anymore. Their reflection was just a second too late. Not an error, not a glitch, something else, something watching us from the other side. The room suddenly felt too small, too silent. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. We turned and saw him, sitting in the shadows, his face hidden. One of us, the same one whose reflection was wrong. He looked up and smiled, and in that moment, we knew. It was already inside. We sealed the doors, blocked the windows, did everything we could to contain it, but it was already too late. The church, our last hope, our final stronghold, felt more like a tomb. The rain outside had turned to a relentless downpour, thunder rolling in waves that shook the walls. Candles flickered in the darkness, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The infected hunter sat in the center of the room, arms limp at his sides. He didn't fight. He didn't beg. He just waited. For what, we didn't know. And then, the whispers started. Not from him. From the walls, from the air itself, a language we didn't understand. Soft at first, then rising, layered. A chorus of voices overlapping, blending, distorting. And then, it spoke. Not from our infected friend, not from behind the walls. It spoke through us. A voice that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Low. Unnatural. Familiar. You were never the hunters. The candles snuffed out. The rain stopped. The silence was so absolute, it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. You were always the prey. And then, the doors burst open. We were not alone anymore. Figures emerged from the darkness, silent, motionless. Not just the infected hunter. More. Too many. Their bodies twisted, their faces half-formed. Some were familiar. Some were ours. People we had lost. People we had buried. But they weren't dead anymore. Not in the way we understood. One of them stepped forward. Their skin rippled, features shifting like liquid. And then, for the briefest moment, it became him. Our fallen friend. The one we had heard screaming behind the stone door. He smiled. And he spoke. Not with 1,000 voices, not with distortion, just his own. It's not so bad. He lifted his hand, a silent invitation. Join us. The figures moved closer, or be forgotten. And at that moment, we understood. This wasn't a war. This wasn't a hunt. This was an erasure. And we were the last ones left. I don't know how much time I have. I don't even know if time works the same way anymore. If you're watching this, if anyone is watching this, it means I made it out. Or at least, I think I did. I keep trying to convince myself that it's over, that I survived, that somehow, against all odds, I'm still me. But I don't know if that's true, because the moment I stop talking, the moment the silence settles in, I start to hear them again. Not voices, not words, just a feeling, like something pressing against the inside of my skull, like a whisper without sound. I should start from the beginning. Or maybe I should start from the end. There were 5 of us when this started. By the time we realized what we were up against, it was already too late. They didn't just kill us. They didn't just tear us apart. They took who we were. And now, I'm the last one left. At least, I think I am. But I keep seeing things. Little things. The way my reflection lags just a second behind my movements. The way my breath fogs up the mirror, even when the room isn't cold. The way my shadow flickers when the light should be steady. I tell myself it's just exhaustion, paranoia. But then there's the other thing. The thing I can't explain. I've started waking up in places I don't remember going to sleep. Woods, abandoned buildings, standing, eyes wide open, like I was waiting for something. Or maybe I was listening. There's one more thing. I don't know how long I've been talking, but a few minutes ago, the door was closed. Now it's open, and I don't remember getting up. I don't remember how I managed to survive everything. I lost good hunters that day, and one of them was a dear brother, Alex Shawn.